reports from Palestinian media, upwards of 30 dead, subsequent fire. This is in refugee tents. This was not an airstrike on a building or a facility somewhere underground. This was in the tents, and it's just the scenes that came out of it last night, some of the most shocking of this entire war.
The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza say at least 35 people have died after an explosion at a refugee camp near Rafah. Now, the Israel Defense Force said it carried out an airstrike targeting Hamas compound in the area. Earlier yesterday, Hamas fired 8 rockets from Rafah towards Tel Aviv. Our reporter Zach Anders is there and can explain a little bit more. Zach, thank you so much. Tell us what happened overnight and to what extent you think that's a retaliation from what happened yesterday.
Well, this is what the IDF says was targeting Yassin Rabia, the manager of Judea and Samaria, the Hamas activity in the West Bank. This is an area where it's closer. The airstrike taking place in the Sultan area is closer to the Mawasi humanitarian refuge than it is from the latest evacuation zone in the Rafah area, at least the latest that was announced by the IDF Arabic spokesperson. The IDF ground forces are still about 2 miles away from this location from where the airstrike was. This is east of Rafah. Again, it's closer to the humanitarian zone. And the images that came out last night was very difficult. There's one in particular of a child being held up by a man, the way that the neck, a decapitated child, the jagged flesh and missing limb, and he holds it up to the cameras. And this is not the first time I've seen images like this, but it's so incredibly difficult. And with, as you just mentioned, reports from Palestinian media, upwards of 30 dead, subsequent fire. This is in refugee tents. This was not an airstrike on a building or a facility somewhere underground. This was in the tents, and it's just the scenes that came out of it last night, some of the most shocking of this entire war.
Yeah, was Israel's response predictable, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think right now, we shouldn't necessarily correlate this with anything that was taking place. With yesterday we had those launches of some 8 rockets from the Rafah area that targeted Tel Aviv, and that was the first time Tel Aviv had a red alarm since January 29th. But I wouldn't necessarily correlate that. I mean, we've seen IDF airstrikes in these areas before, and in areas where they've designated as safe refugee areas as well. Now, this kind of sits, but the exact location of this airstrike sits between the latest designated refugee humanitarian area and the evacuation notice area. So it's kind of, it wasn't in a specific zone. But we have noted, and there's been some really great investigative reporting. CNN has put together some really great work about airstrikes in areas that the IDF has told the population were safe, that they were refugee areas. Over the course of this conflict, it's happened several times before. So I wouldn't correlate this with anything in particular or with that rocket launch that took place yesterday on Tel Aviv. I think the IDF, as we'll probably hear later today, I'm sure, will say this was an opportunity to take out a Hamas commander, that the Hamas commander felt like they could use being around children and being in a refugee area to try and escape that threat of an airstrike. In all probability, we've seen over the course of the last 6-7 months that these Hamas leaders have been mostly holed up in the tunnels, and in the moments when they do come above ground, they're with their families, or they're, one of the strikes that comes to mind is with Ismail Haniyeh's sons. When an airstrike hit his vehicle, the son's vehicle, they also had their children inside the vehicle, killed some young kids under 10 years old as well.
Benny Gantz had said the rocket launches that we've just talked about showed the need for sort of this military push ahead with its assaults. Israel is treading a very cautious line in whatever action it takes. It potentially alienates even more support from its allies.
It does. And, when I I really had a hard time sleeping last night after watching those videos. I do not know what the end of the rope is after at this point. You know, we've got
Mm.
thousands of children dead. I do not understand how after you've burned every bridge, you've got now in the discourse inside Israeli media, just absolute shock that Spain is going to recognize Palestine as a state, and several other nations as well, and that this is, you know, the result of October 7th is going to be in the Israeli mindset rewarding Hamas for October 7th by giving them statehood, and that they're now elevated on the world stage. Well, how can the conduct of this war now 7, 8 months in, I just don't understand where this is going on the international stage. You know, the United States support through this election year is going to be strained. I'm actually heading south right now. There's going to be a press tour with Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador and presidential candidate, and I'm going to be interested to hear what her thoughts are about, you know, America's place in all this going forward. Because again, how can Israel's conduct throughout the course of this war continue on the international stage and not have serious consequences in the global community?
Of course, and remind us how different that might look in terms of Israel's relationship with the US, dependent on who's sitting in the White House.
You know, this is the real, as an American, I'm, you know, the 2016 election broke us. The 2020 election was very difficult. This election, I don't know what's going to happen. I think the fact that we've got a president who is indicted, who called for, you know, called Secretary of State in Georgia during the last election, said, just give me 10,000 votes. And that the fact that a man that can do that is still leading in the polls, cause for alarm, certainly, but I think that you give the keys back to President Trump. I don't know that he's going to conduct himself in the same way on the international stage as he did before, because when he was president the first time, he was handcuffed in a lot of ways by some of the old guard that, you know, in 2016, the MAGA hadn't infiltrated deep into the State Department or our embassies, but now there's a huge undercurrent of diplomats and, you know, men on the ground, men and women who are working on MAGA's behalf. And I think that if he's going to get reelected, there's going to be a much different American global policy, probably a very home front first policy, where we're going to, I would think that administration would largely allow for these sorts of things to happen and pull their, you know, their U.S. presence back, and
And
you
wouldn't
know,
play such an active role, maybe in the way we have been seeing in the last few months.
yeah,
Just
exactly.
the wider context of this, you know, there's supposed to be further ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas, expected to resume, you know, fairly soon. What we've seen, you know, a real sort of escalation from both sides in the last 48 hours. How much does that hamper, do you think, those talks when they start again?
And that would, I think the premise of that is, were the talks going to be able to get off the ground in the first place? They met in Paris on Friday, the CIA director, Bill Burns, and the Qatari prime minister and the Mossad director, and they agreed to resume talks this week. They were hoping for early this week, and it wasn't entirely clear either whether or not this is going to take place in Cairo again, and how the Egyptians will be involved, although the Americans say that the Egyptians will be involved in these talks. Um, I I think that going into this, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that there will be more latitude for the negotiating team, but the thing that broke down the talks to begin with, or in early May, it still stands, and that's, we will not end this war. This will not lead to a complete ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities. Hamas issued a statement saying that is going to be the only thing that will get a deal done again. So we're exactly where we were when these all broke down in the beginning of May. And nobody has very much confidence from what I'm hearing from the Israeli side that there will be able to be a deal under this framework, really under Prime Minister Netanyahu. Uh, to be able to get a deal done, you have to come back from the ledge and this extreme stance of we will continue, we will go into Rafah, we're going to end Hamas. You're dealing with a terrorist organization in negotiations here that have hostages. So, one of the conversations I had the other day with an Israeli is we don't have to tell a terrorist organization the truth. We don't have to. We can tell them, sure, we'll end the war, get our hostages back, and then do whatever we want after. And that's something I've heard over the last few months. But it is a bit head scratching to see the prime minister in this rules-based order framework continue to press on and say, nope, we can't get this deal done because we can't end the war.
Mm.
And all the hostage families going, why not? This it's so extreme, it's such an extremist stance.
Zach, thank you as ever. It's so brilliant to have your time and analysis on the programme. Zach Anders in Tel Aviv. Thank you so much.